This is the video to accompany Chapter 1 from the Wade and Ferree textbook. This is a fairly short chapter. I do add additional material, as you probably have seen if you've already reviewed the slides. So this video is to both hit the high spots of what's in the chapter, as well as to go into a little bit more detail and explanation in regards to that additional material. And so if you were wondering about these really striking portraits that you see on the cover of your textbook, the cover of both the first as well as the second edition, and you want more information about that photographer and artist, I do provide a link to his website, Leland Bobby. And, I think the idea behind these portraits is really just kind of playing into this, to this assumption that we have around the innateness of gender, and that we have these strong associations with what it means to be masculine versus what it means to be feminine. And these portraits kind of indicate how with, some makeup and a wig and some fierce posing, how we can very easily blur these lines. And I think that part of the reason why the authors kind of chose these photographs to kind of highlight in their text is because this idea that gender is not as innate as we think that it is, and that it's socially constructed, that idea is really key in the discipline of sociology. And so we're going to talk about that more in this first chapter. So this chapter opens up with what I hope you found to be some pretty interesting tidbit of knowledge, and that is the history of high heels. And if you want more information on that, I do provide a video link both here in the slides and on the Canvas page for your course. And so it starts off by saying that kind of our earliest known instances of people wearing high heels actually dates back to really early history in the Persian army. And this is back during the time where it was like Persians and the Ottomans. And so this is very old. And high heels, they were actually like weapons of war. They were very sharp. The army wore them on horses. It made it easy for them to kind of like gouge out the eyes of their opponents. And so when Europeans noticed this, they began to wear high heels in their daily lives. And that's because they kind of linked this to like masculinity and power. High heels were these weapons of war, and even though they were no longer wearing them for military reasons, it was nevertheless a very high status masculine footwear item. As with most fashions, whether you're talking about, fancy shoes, designer bags, designer jeans, it does trickle down. And as we go a little later in history in Europe, these heels started to be worn by men of all classes. And part of it and during this time where public health concerns were not as well addressed, the streets in these crowded cities can be really disgusting. And these heels allowed you to be a little bit above the muck on the ground. And around this time, this is the 1630s, masculine fashions are becoming in for ladies. And so they start wearing high heels as well. As a form of what your textbook says, masculine mimicry. And so this continues, and, we know people like, King Louis, your book mentions that in his court, no one was allowed to have heels higher than him, and the masses persisted in wearing them. And it wasn't until we reached the Enlightenment era and that shift to logic and reason that these heels kind of started to be seen as silly and frivolous, and it was intelligence that bestowed superiority on aristocrats, not their heel height, and not to mention, like, these shoes are super impractical. Ask any woman like myself that still wears them today. So during the Age of Enlightenment, for the most part, these shoes fell out of fashion for men. But they still remain very much in fashion for women. And although, just how high the heels should be in order to be fashionable, although that's fluctuated over time, to this day, it still persists that when we say high heels, we think of this as being a gendered item, and in the sense that it's an item that we assign to be worn by women, or people impersonating women. And it's interesting in light of the fact that, this early history, it was the opposite. It was a gendered item, but it was an item associated with men. And so your textbook opens with that story because it introduces the sociological definition of the term distinction. And basically, this is just a way of saying that groups seek to distinguish themselves from one another. And there are all types of distinctions that we make, class distinctions, race distinctions. Obviously, in this class, we're going to focus on gender distinctions. You know, we distinguish people based on like their level of taste. Do you like highbrow taste? Do you go to Broadways and ballet, and do you like classical music, or what we consider to be lowbrow? Certain forms of comedy and pop music and videos on YouTube, right? But the idea is that groups uh, uh, seek to distinguish themselves from one another. And so we make these distinctions kind of based on what we think is important, because we don't make distinctions as a society if it's a difference that we haven't assigned any real importance to. And so, your book talks about, we don't really, even though we know that we differ, in terms of whether or not you have an attached or unattached earlobe, we don't go around making a distinction around earlobe attachment, or whether you can curl your tongue, or whether um, your pointer finger is longer than your middle finger. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of some of the differences that we know exist between us in terms of our physiology, but we really haven't built around this cultural discussion around these differences, in the sense that we haven't used them to base groups around. But for some characteristics, skin color, being one, we have, as a society, made the decision to say, oh, we think that these differences are significant, and we distinguish one another on the basis of it. So in this sense, your book says, this concept of gender, it exists because we want to distinguish people in this particular way, that we think it's important to know, who are the men in our society, who are the women, are they acting sufficiently masculine or feminine, and this has been how we have classified ourselves and distinguished one another, for centuries. But one thing that this course, beginning with this first chapter, is going to try to pick apart is exactly, why do we do that? What is the motivation behind that? And so in order to pick that apart, we have to really grasp the distinction between three terms that sometimes people can conflate with one another, meaning they use them interchangeably as if they're synonyms or almost the same thing. And that's not, in fact, true. All of these terms have very precise and actual meanings, and they are not synonymous with one another. And so we're going to talk about gender and sex and sexual orientation. And I give you a little helpful depiction there of a guy that is meant to kind of help you kind of start thinking about how do you break these terms down into something distinct. And so we're going to begin with what oftentimes people think is the most straightforward of the terms, and that is sex, or what is sometimes called biological sex. Sex is not the same thing as gender, and hopefully this will become more clear when we discuss what gender is. But sex is frequently treated as a binary, right? We say, you are born male or female, or male-bodied or female-bodied. You're XX, you're XY. So we speak about this in terms of, your sex chromosomes, your sex hormones, and your sex organs. And although we treat this like it is a perfect binary, it is in fact not. People can vary away from that binary along all three of those characteristics I just said. So they can have sex organs that don't represent that perfect binary. They could potentially have some aspects of both sex organs. They can have, sexual hormones. What I mean by that is that oftentimes we associate, of course, women with having a higher percentage of estrogen than men, especially post-puberty, and men having a higher ratio of testosterone than women post-puberty. But in reality, of course, men and women as individuals have both, and there can even be some overlap in the sense that a man could possibly be low testosterone, and a woman can be high testosterone and have more testosterone than a man. So if you were looking at this, if you were looking at her sex hormones mapped out, she would present as what we would expect to see in a man. One term for this is hyperandrogenism, which has received a lot more media attention because of the case of the Olympic track star from South Africa, Caster Semenya. And I give you just one article. There have been many updates. This has been an ongoing saga because she has hyperandrogenism. So she naturally has a lot more testosterone than the so-called normal woman. And this has raised questions about, her participation in the Olympics and what should be done. And so far, there has not been a easy conclusion to her story. But for people who do not fit this perfect binary, the term that we commonly use is intersex. And you might think that this is extremely rare, but this is actually 0.01% to 0.02% of the population. Or another way of thinking about it, it's about 18 out of 100,000 births. And I know that sounds super rare, but you need to think about all the billions of people that live in the world, and and what does that mean if you're talking about 18 out of every 100,000? I once saw a documentary that made the point that I always like to come back to, because I feel like it's a very good sticking point, and it helps people remember, is that rough percentage of the intersex population, that 0.01 to 0.02%, is about the same as natural redheads. So whether you realize it or not, if you, statistically speaking, if you know natural redheads, right, if you know one or two in your life and you've come across them in your travels, then you also, whether you know it or not, statistically speaking, know people who are intersex. And it's worth noting that not everyone who is intersex is even necessarily aware that they are intersex. Oftentimes this condition, if it is even visible or knowable at birth, which it is not always. It historically has been kept hidden from the individual, and in some cases, were even surgeries that were performed on infants, what they call genital confirmation surgeries, where they basically fixed intersex individuals as infants, thus kind of stripping them from their agency to make those decisions later in life, which is why several countries, as well as several states in the United States, have now banned this practice. But it was very common up through the 90s. And some people, if it is not in fact visible or knowable at birth that they are intersex, it is more likely to present during puberty, and or for women when they are seeking to get pregnant. And so all of this is just meant to suggest, because I will go into this deeper when we get to the bodies chapter, but it's just meant to suggest that even the concept that we think of as being the most clear and transparent and straightforward actually isn't as straightforward as we like to make it. Even sex, which we're like, is what you're born as, you're XX, you're XY, you're male, you're female. Even that is not, in fact, a perfect binary. And as I've said, sex is not the same thing as gender. But just focusing on what does it mean to be male-bodied or female-bodied, let's stop and think for a second. To what extent do male bodies and female bodies really differ outside of those the aforementioned, sex organs? So of course, if we're talking about primary sexual characteristics, genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, breast, and body hair, there are some differences. But are men and women's bodies as dramatically different as we maybe think that they are? So yes, in general, men are hairier than women, but let's be honest, women, if we did not shave and wax and nair and electrolysis, we are in fact hairier than what we let on. Similarly, we say men have broader shoulders and they have, bigger chest, and women have wider hips. And yes, to a certain extent, that is how some of us are in fact naturally built. But for those broad shoulders and those pec muscles, you can't ignore in who's more likely to be in the weight room, while in most gyms, women are more likely to be in the group X or the cardio deck. Who is more likely to be buying those massive jugs of like protein and creatine to build muscle. Who's encouraged even from, the age of 6, 7, 8 in physical fitness tests to do full pull-ups and push-ups versus push-ups on their knees, which we call, of course, girl push-ups. So whether I'm talking about, men buying creatine or women doing push-ups on their knees, or, women, waxing their mustache versus men being encouraged to grow out their beards, those are social practices. And that's just meant to suggest that naturally, for a lot of us, our bodies would not be so dramatically different from one another if we did not engage in these social practices. So, if you put on put us in baggy overalls, so you could not necessarily see our genitalia or our breast, and even something like breast, which we know is related to fat distribution. So larger people, regardless of whether or not them being male-bodied or female-bodied, have breast. But if we had on these baggy overalls, right? If our genitalia was more or less covered up, but we weren't engaging in these social practices, women weren't wearing makeup, they weren't doing the hair removal, men weren't cutting their hair short or growing it out long. We all, either starved ourselves into extreme slimness or gorged ourselves into largeness. It raises the question, would you be able to tell from, 50 feet away, 20 feet away, oh yes, that is a male-bodied person, that is a female-bodied person? We act like that these things are as straightforward as these kind of t-shirts, these funny t-shirts. make it seem, but that's just not true for humans. And that's because when it comes to sexual dimorphism, the physical difference between the sexes, humans exhibit a fairly low level of sexual dimorphism. There are other animals that have much more stark differences between their male-bodied and female-bodied creatures. And I give you just three examples right there, whether you're talking about the differences between lions and lionesses, whether you're talking about the difference between peacocks and peahens, or whether or not you're talking about, elephant seals, in terms of size, in terms of plumage, in terms of mane. There are a lot of animals that have high sexual dimorphism. So it isn't that they engage in social practices, right? It's not like the female lion is out there shaving off her mane, once a week. They are innately just much more different. And that's just not the case with human male-bodied and female-bodied individuals. And even something like height, which tends to be one of the more stronger physical differences in terms of correlation with gender. Even something like height. It's worth noting, right, that although within a given society, on average, men are taller by several inches than their female counterparts, this difference between men and women becomes a lot more dicey when you start comparing cross-nationally, because the average height of women in Iceland and Netherlands, for instance, 5'6", 5'7", is several inches taller. Let me go back to make my point. Several inches taller than the average height of men in India or China. And so even height is the type of physical difference that is not necessarily as related to sex as we might think it is. But what is clear is that in a lot of societies, there is this very strong gendered expectation that men are supposed to be taller than women, because we associate height with power and dominance and strength. And we see this by the fact that for a lot of men and women, men marry women shorter than themselves. Women marry men taller than themselves when we're talking about heterosexual couples. But it's worth noting that there is that overlap. And that's fine. But it's society that is sometimes uncomfortable with that overlap, that's uncomfortable with that reversal, and which suggests this is more than just about, there being a physiological difference that we expect from the sexes, that there is some type of cultural meaning attached to the fact that we expect men to be tall and women to be shorter. A good example from this, and I'm probably dating myself here because I'm sure a lot of you were not alive, when Princess Di and Prince Charles were married. But in reality, and you see this picture there, and that might not be the best picture to make this point, but if you look, it's like, okay, they're the same height. And in reality, the actual kind of argument is that she was an inch or so taller. She was a tall woman. It's not that he wasn't tall, it's just she was taller. But yet, when they got married, the commemorative stamp that was put out in the U.S. to celebrate their nuptials, if you were to look at that stamp and try to gauge their heights, you would assume that she was like almost a whole foot shorter than him, which once again raises questions about, why as a society would we be uncomfortable with this idea that women can be just as tall as men. And this idea that it is that there's this discomfort, that we build these kind of expectations and these meanings around these fairly minute physiological differences. This is what starts pushing us towards gender and not just sex. I like to say, could we really see sex if not for gender? And so in order to understand what that means, you need to understand what it means, what the term gender actually means. And so, in order to explain gender, and I promise I have a slide coming up which gives you more actual detail, but I do love the genderbread person. And this is version 3.3, because it really breaks down all of the kind of components of gender, as well as it clarifies what gender is not. Because what you see there is biological sex, and they have it pointing down there towards where the sex organs are. That can be measured on a continuum of femaleness and maleness. Um, and they acknowledge there that someone can be intersex, and that people could have undergone gender transformation surgeries that would also change their genitalia. And then gender itself can kind of be thought of as two components: gender identity, which we'll talk about more, and gender expression, which we'll also talk about more on the next slide. And that, once again, none of that has anything to do with sexual and romantic attraction, because although we aren't going to spend a lot of time in this chapter on the topic of sexual orientation, that is another one that I oftentimes hear students conflate. A masculine woman, so in terms of her gender expression, she is masculine in her expression, or a feminine man might result in people saying like, oh, I know that person is gay, or I know he likes men or she likes women. And that's because they're taking that person's gender expression and they're linking it to stereotypes related to sexual orientation. And I always just like to correct students, remind students, you don't know someone's sexual orientation unless they tell you. And I used to say, you don't know someone's sexual orientation until you see them, mid-sexual intimate act. And someone, and that was back when I was first teaching, and wasn't the discussion around sexual orientation being a continuum wasn't as well voiced, as popularly voiced as it was now. But then I started thinking about, well, I know that's not even true, because if you saw someone in the act and they were with a person of maybe the same gender, you might be like, oh, that person is homosexual. But in reality, maybe they're bisexual, and you're just catching them on, on a particular day or in a particular moment. So, you don't know anyone's sexual orientation unless you ask. You probably shouldn't go around asking unless you're interested in dating or hooking up with that person. But you certainly don't know someone's sexual orientation just because you are observing their gender expression. So let's talk a little bit more about this term gender. So this is gender. This is the socially constructed categories that we associate with, the biological physical sex. So we start off with these biological categories, female and male, but then we build around these categories expectations for how we think males and females should behave, how we feel like they should look, how we feel like they should act, what roles they should play in society. And that's what gender is. It is the social constructed narrative around physical sex. And so for gender identity, we have a different set of terms, right? So these are identity terms. So male, female are sex terms. For gender, most commonly, we've used man and woman. In recent years, as we have acknowledged our transgender population, we have started using the term cisgender man, cisgender woman, and that's just acknowledging that your gender identity aligns with the sex that you were assigned at birth. So on my birth certificate, it says female, and I do identify as a woman, so I'm a cisgender woman. Now, if I did not and I identify as a man, even though I was assigned female at birth, then I would be a transgender man. And so those are the most common terms, but there are increasingly a broad variety of terms that people use in order to identify. Some of the other more common contemporary terms would be things like androgynous, which speaks to gender expression, and that people who are androgynous oftentimes do not engage in masculine or feminine gender expression. Instead, it's something much more gender neutral. Gender fluid is the idea that both your identity as well as maybe your expression is fluid. It can change by, the moment, by the context, by the situation. Bigender is someone that, identifies as both, and agender is someone who identifies as neither. Other terms you maybe have heard could be terms like, gender queer. And so there are a lot of, or gender questioning, or gender nonconforming. And so I give you two articles that you can read to maybe learn a little bit more. The first article was written in reaction to the changes that Facebook made a few years ago when they increased their gender options. And there was a little bit of outcry from some circles. And so this article was meant to just try to explain what all those options meant. And then the National Geographic put out a great gender issue a few years ago. If we were in person, I always bring it in and I pass it around class so students can kind of see the articles and the photographs, because it really is it's a great resource. But this article provides kind of a gender glossary, so it gives you some precise definitions for some of those terms. Now, the second component of gender is not just how you identify, which, if we go back to my little genderbread person, right, identity is in, your mind, your head. The second part of gender is gender expression, right? And so, or what can be called gender symbolism. So this is how you act and how you present yourself. And this can either uphold societal expectations, right? How society expects men and women to behave, and we have terms for that. We expect men to be masculine, and when we'll talk more about masculinity, but when I say that, that relates to specific things in regards to appearance, in regards to behavior, regards to emotions, regards to, likes and dislikes. And then we as society, when we talk about how we commonly expect women to behave, to present themselves, to be, the term that we use is feminine. In the same way that our gender identity terms have broadened, we also have had an expansion of gender expression. So some of those same terms that we have in gender identity are also relevant here. Once again, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, androgynous. Those can be terms that also can refer not just to your identity, but also to your expression. So gender isn't merely biological. It is these cultural expectations, these cultural narratives, these cultural beliefs that we build around what is biological, which is sex. And so your book notes that we have put a great deal of human effort, to create these shared cultural ideals, to say, okay, we think men should behave like this, we think women should behave like that. 800 years ago, we were like, hey, yes, it's manly men who fight in violent, vicious wars, who wear high heels. And now we say, it's a certain type of woman who wears, very high heels. And so we're always kind of tweaking, our shared cultural ideals around gender. But at the same time, up until recently, there has been real resistance to just like throwing off this label of distinction. for anyone to just say, you know what, gender doesn't matter. As an individual, you can be whoever you want to be. It really isn't that important. The people that you have sexual intimacy with will figure out, what you're working with in terms of, sex organs, and, your reproduction decision should also be left up to you. Whether you have the ability to reproduce or want to reproduce or not. But for the most part, except for maybe a small but increasingly vocal minority, a lot of society is still very committed to this distinction. We still feel that gender is a very important way in which we distinguish one another. And so, this chapter really encourages to, ask why. And so before we get into that, this is the part where I really want you to start thinking, about how gender might be structuring or impacting your own life. And I am offering a little bit of extra credit for this. 2 points. 2 points. It, you would need to post it to the module 1 extra credit discussion forum that I've already created. And basically, I just want you to walk me through your typical day, right? You wake up, you get showered, you get ready for the gym, you come back from the gym, you shower, you get dressed, put on makeup, do hair. This is my schedule. And once you get through your entire schedule, whatever a typical day is for you, I want you to go back and beside any activity that you believe is influenced by your gender in any way, I want you to mark it somehow. You can bold it, you can underline it, you can make it italics. And then after you go through your schedule and you kind of mark it up that way, trying to think about what parts of your day are in some way shaped by gender, I want you to just answer, the question, so how do you think gender influences your life, in just 3 to 5 thoughtful sentences. And, keep in mind this will be public because it will be on the discussion forum. To maybe get you started thinking about how gender impacts your life, I'm going to encourage you to watch this short and funny, in my opinion, BuzzFeed article that kind of walks us through the typical day in the life of a man or a woman. I normally show this in class. Students usually find it to be pretty cute. Keep in mind, it is stereotypical. It's meant to be very normative, meaning, for the average cisgender man and the average cisgender woman, this might be what their day looks like. And so, really just start to think how, beyond your male bodiness or your female bodiness, how society's expectations of you, whether you are a man or a woman, or whether you identify as something beyond either of those identity designations, but how society's expectations of you, or the fact that they don't have expectations of you, right, or they don't quite know what to do with your identity classification, as if you identify as something like gender nonconforming or agender. But really start to think of how that might be influencing some of your decisions, in terms of what you do in a day, what you eat or don't eat, what activities you engage in, how you interact with others, when and where you feel safe or don't feel safe. I feel like this is always just a really good activity to get students to start thinking about this question. Why do we work so hard to maintain this fantasy of a perfect binary? That we are men and women, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that we are these very different and distinct creatures, and that, men are masculine men and women are feminine, ladies. And in this chapter, although they will go into it more deeply in later chapters, they do start providing an answer to that question about why as society we have built so much time, energy, and effort into keeping these distinctions going. And that's because of the relationship these distinctions have with power. And this is true of any and all distinctions, that we make distinctions between groups because if we did not make distinctions between groups, it would be very hard for us to place groups in a hierarchy, that this group is superior to that group. In order to say that, we have to be able to distinguish between the two. And this is true of race, this is true of social class, this is true of sexual orientation. In some countries, this is true of religion, right? That we want to be able to make these distinctions so we can kind of figure out who's better, who's worse, who's superior, who's inferior. And this is certainly has been true when it comes to gender, because if we know, if we can easily identify you as a man versus a woman, then this perhaps changes how we perceive you, how we treat you, how much, respect we give you, whether or not we encroach upon your space. And so it really makes us start thinking about this relationship between gender and power. And one way you can think about this is oftentimes when and where you feel gender visible. Because in the gender hierarchy, women are at the bottom of the hierarchy, they oftentimes feel gender visible in places and spaces where they are not a lot of women. So for me, that would be like, I don't know, like whenever I have to take my car to the auto mechanic, for instance, or when I go, when gyms are back open and I go into like the heavy free weight section to use like the Smith machine, because there are not a lot of women in that space. Sometimes it's in spaces and places where there is the potential for danger. So, oftentimes when we have this discussion in class, most women almost always mention, anywhere at night or anywhere that's isolated or anywhere where they are alone. And especially if they're having to walk by groups of men, they feel gender visible because in these places, in these spaces, they're very aware of the lack of power that they have in these spaces. For men, when I ask, where do you feel gender visible? Oftentimes they have a harder time answering this question. And that's because the way society is set up, men are not usually in positions where they're gender visible. Now, in a sociology class in gender, if we were having this class in person, usually my men often say in this class, because I normally have in a class of 50, maybe in a good semester, 8 to 10 men. But then that still means that I have 30, 35, 40 women. But in a lot of spaces, men are usually not necessarily the minority. In spaces where they would be the minority, because those spaces are associated with femininity, a lot of men don't put themselves in those spaces, right? So you don't necessarily, they aren't in nail salons, or, they aren't necessarily, in fancy, shopping boutiques. And when they are in those places, what's oftentimes very interesting is, even though they might feel gender visible, do you think they still feel that same sense of being disempowered or possibly endangered or possibly scared? And the answer that most of my male students usually say at this point is no, right? They aren't scared to be in female dominated spaces because they aren't scared of women. And they aren't scared of women because in our society, women lack both the physical as well as the structural power to usually engender such fear in men. And so this introduces a concept that Michael Kimmel, who is a sociologist of masculinity, and I've used his textbook in the past, so you'll hear me reference some of his ideas and concepts throughout this semester. He has this term, the privilege of invisibility. People who are in power on the basis of their race, their gender, their social class, they have the privilege of being invisible, in the sense of they are not defined by that characteristic. They aren't defined by that distinction. Obviously, they're not actually invisible. This isn't like a John Cena, you can't see me type of situation going on. We see them, we see that they are men, but because they are men in a patriarchal society, they aren't usually defined by their manness, meaning that it doesn't become the characteristic that people judge and evaluate them on. And if you want to think about this a little further, think about the fact if I say the word doctor, police officer, firefighter, pilot, oftentimes the stereotypical perception that we have of those occupations are men. And we know this because usually if it's a woman holding these positions, people will say things like, oh, I had a female pilot, or, oh, my doctor is a woman. And even just using the word police officer and firefighter, it didn't even almost feel right rolling off my tongue, because I grew up in an age where it was much more common to say fireman and policeman because those were the norms, right? And when you are the norm, and especially when you are the norm and the empowered norm, you have that privilege of being invisible. You do not have to be defined by this characteristic. You get to be an individual. You aren't just this distinguishing characteristic. Now, if you want to imagine a world that's the opposite, I invite you to check out this short, I think it's like 11 to 12 minutes, French film called The Oppressed Majority. It is in French. It does have subtitles. I normally show this in my class because it really flips this whole thing on its head, right? It imagines a society where women are now in the societal position of power. So they get to enjoy the privilege of being invisible. They get to do things like catcall, with disregard and as to whether or not they're making men feel uncomfortable. They get to pee in public and with disregard, that someone could possibly see their genitalia. They get to make decisions for their husband and for their household without having to check in with their spouse or their partner. And so, especially if you're struggling to kind of wrap your head around what I'm saying when I'm talking about gender visibility and the privilege of being invisible, I do strongly encourage you to just check out that 12-minute film. If you want an even longer film, and it's by the same director from the short film, she later expanded upon her idea and turned it more comedic. I think that was to get money to produce it. But she turned it into a full-length film called I Am Not an Easy Man. Last I checked, it was on Netflix. But I give you a YouTube trailer, and you can kind of see that it's still a very similar idea, but it has a more comedic take on it. So I'm going to end with a quote from the book. Now, this quote is from the first edition. There is very similar wording at the end of, the second edition, which is the book I assigned, but I much prefer this quote, which is why I have it here. So just consider this and, really, come back to this quote as we're moving throughout the textbook this semester. It will kind of remind you of like what the author's argument, what the author's main point is that they're trying to make here about gender, the social construction of gender. So this quote says, "Difference is necessary for hierarchy. We can't think more highly of one type of person than another unless we have at least two types. Distinction then must be maintained if we are going to value certain types of people more than others. Wealth and power continue to be hoarded and monopolized. These inequalities are justified, made to seem normal and natural, by producing differences that make group membership seem meaningful and inequality inevitable or right. And these categories aren't all bad. They give us a sense of belonging and bring joy and pleasure into our lives, but they also serve as classifications by which we can unevenly distribute power and privilege." And so I really like to end there on chapter 1, because I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad about, wanting to be a real man or enjoying being a woman. I don't think most of you would know me for my time at CSUB, but at least in terms of gender expression, I am extremely feminine. I am always in heels. I'm almost always in dresses. I pretty much always wear makeup. I enjoy that. As she says, it brings me joy and pleasure. But I have to acknowledge that also femininity, right? And the perceptions that people have of women and feminine women, maybe in particular, that those perceptions do introduce inequities into my life. Those perceptions do introduce violence. I have been catcalled. I have been sexually assaulted. I have been disrespected in a variety of spaces, including my classroom, usually by male students who do not respect the fact that I have authority in this space, due to my position and role. And that is what I really like to emphasize, right? That no one is pushing us towards that world that I mentioned, where we're all androgynous, wearing baggy, suits, and we're all gender free, gender neutral. But we do have to be aware of the ways in which, by living and contributing to a gendered society, the ways in which we are perpetuating inequities. And that is what a lot of this course is going to be about. So that is it for chapter 1. And if you want to participate in the extra credit, that's the only real assignment for this week. And I'll be back with you next week for chapter 2.